Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see you, brave souls, Nanooks of the North, who have really not as much snow arrived as we expected, so we're grateful. It is my privilege and pleasure to introduce to you the Most Reverend Christopher Harper, National Indigenous Archbishop of the Anglican Church of Canada. I'm not going to do the rundown of where he went to school and all that kind of stuff, because that's less important than when I was Bishop of Brandon, this man was my neighbor. Because Brandon had Saskatchewan and Saskatoon and Qu'Appelle just over the Saskatchewan border. He has been a brother and companion, someone with whom I can laugh and talk through all of these things. He has a wealth and a depth of wisdom that the church has been blessed with. I know he has wonderful things to impart to you. And I want you to understand that this diocese has made significant contributions to the Indigenous church in the last couple of years. But this prospect of walking the road of reconciliation is a longer-term project. In the West, the young ones would say, it took 7 generations to get in this mess, and it's going to take us 7 generations to get out. When one of my youth groups that was all Indigenous called themselves the 3rd generation. They figured they got to prepare their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids, and that'll get them to 6. 7 is where the destination is. So, Archbishop Chris, good to have you with us.
My name is Chris Harper. I come from the Plains Cree. My home reserve is Onion Lake First Nation. And we are a reserve that is, right on the border of Alberta and Saskatchewan, a little bit, not central, but a little bit north. And we live along the eskers of where the great glaciers started to melt and dropped all the gravel and sand, and washed away all the topsoil more to the south. So we used to laugh that our reserve was if gravel ever comes into vogue, we're rich. And so at that point in time, until they discovered that we have heavy oil and natural gas underneath us. And then instantly that helped us with finances, and it helped us a lot with bringing us up out of the isolation that our reserve is in. We sit on the border of Alberta, Saskatchewan, right on Highway 17. I used to call it the conundrum of the world because I used to work on the Saskatchewan side in EMS as an EMT, EMTA Advanced. And I was also director of operations for the local ambulance company and emergency response. And then going over onto the Alberta side, my wife used to work there as working within the store itself. But the conundrum of the world, why I called it that, was we had 2 time zones, Mountain Standard and Central. And so I worked on Central and my wife worked on Mountain Standard. My children went to school in Saskatchewan, so they were on Central. So we had this living room clock was on Central, and the kitchen clock was on Mountain Standard. It was long distance to call across the road because we had two area codes, 780 and 306. 306 for Saskatchewan, 780 for Alberta. It was long distance to call across the road. Our post office had a Saskatchewan postal code, but sat on the Alberta side. So, like I said, we come from a community that is very much in itself very confused. And on our reserve was one of the few Canadian reserves that had 2 residential schools. It had St. Anthony's Roman Catholic, and it had also St. Barnabas Anglican. My mother was in residential school, which makes me 2nd generation when we're talking about the generations. 2nd generation. My mother was in residential school, and to this date, as I've said in conversations, she has not yet talked about. And when I've asked her about what her experience, what she got out of residential, she won't talk. She changes the subject very quickly and will not, even entering upon the conversation. Let me see here. My mother was a hard worker. She raised my brothers and my sister and I. I am the oldest of the family. In fact, I am the first grandchild of Victor Harper and Christina Heathen. So I always thought it would have been interesting if I kept on the matriarchal line with my grandmother, kept the Heathen name. This way I would have been known as the Archbishop Heathen. Is there a heathen in the room? Oh yeah, that's me. Let me see here. So the Harper name we're not really, I've always struggled to be connected with the name, because it was a name that was given to us by the Indian agent, who was approached my great-grandfather and shook his hand and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Harper, that's who you are now." And that's how we became Harpers. And I've always struggled even with trying to find my own identity, because my full name is Christopher Anthony Harper. So now you know my relationship with the last name. But my first name, Christopher Anthony, was given to me by the nuns, because my mother wasn't qualified or smart enough, as they termed her, to name me. So I'm named after the saints. So my struggle is always to try to find my identity, who I was. And because we have somewhere in the woodpile a Mr. Dillon, who was a prospector and a trapper that passed through from coming up through Oregon and coming up through the Great Trail, going up to the Great North, left some children behind. And I'm one of the descendants, so thus I have fairer skin. And so I've always struggled on reserve, because a lot of my cousins are a whole lot darker than me. And, but so I've always had that struggle, being, as I have termed it and deemed it, that I walk in two worlds. I live in two worlds, and I come from two worlds. So thus trying to be a bridge, to try to bridge these two different entities of who I am, what I'm called to be as an Indigenous person, as well as a Christian, and now as an Archbishop. Let me see here. My ministries have been on reserve and off reserve and to the Métis. In the Diocese of Saskatchewan, I had a total of, one of my parishes I had 3 main churches, 6 part-time, and one that was brought into the fold. So in total I had technically 10 churches, and I was blessed to be able to say that I also had, because I was also Lutheran under one church that was at Zion Lutheran, and I also was looking just across the block and down at the end of the street, St. George's Anglican in Kingston. And so I was one of the few clergy that had 2 bishops. I had 7 wardens and 1 chairman, all within the parish. And on services, I was blessed to be able to do Sundays. On average was minimum 3 services on Sundays, to the maximum of about 6 to 7 services on a Sunday, plus services for the part-time churches on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday, I tried to do preparation work and classes. Friday, I taught, and Saturdays, I did weddings and baptismal preparation as needed. So that gives you an indicating idea of who I am and where I come from. The hardest challenge was when I had 1 church. And it was a nice big church, but it was also in places that were rather complicated. I was at that time in Thunder Bay. So I think everybody's seen the problems that comes out of Thunder Bay a little bit, and it's been, it's bad when it's documented on the CBC. So it gives you an idea anyway of where I come from and how I came into the picture. I started my ministry in the Diocese of Saskatchewan. I started my ministry training at the James Settee College for Indigenous Ministries. And I did that for quite a while until Bishop Anthony Burton at the time called me into the office. And whenever you get called into the bishop's office, that's usually not a good response to you're questioning, what did I do? So he came in and he said, have you ever considered yourself for the priesthood? And I said, not really. And he said, well, I want you to think and pray about it. And I said, okay, and I'll continue on. And he said, continue on with your studies. And I said, very well. So 4 years later, he calls me into the office and he says, I think you're ready. And I said, good. For what? He said, I'm going to send you away to seminary. He says, these are all the colleges. This is all the way from the Atlantic School of Theology in the east to the Vancouver School of Theology over here in the west. He says, but this is where you're going. And Wycliffe, Toronto. So I signed up over everything. At that point in time, I was a businessman. We were running a restaurant, my wife and I. I was the manager, director of operations, and the startup individual for the local ambulance and emergency response. Plus, I also had my own first aid company, and and it went on. I had 22 responsibilities on the reserve when I decided to take up ministry, and I basically closed it all off, signed everything over, gave everything over to those that were to be taking it further on. We gave up the restaurant, which is good because I was already $36,000. Don't get into a restaurant if anyone wants to be a restaurateur here. Let me see here, what else? And then we put everything of ours that we could into the back of a half-ton, and my wife and I drove off to Toronto, to the University of Toronto, to begin my studies. It was a culture shock and societal and ministry shock all at once. And my wife basically for just about 3.5 years, because I did an accelerated program because I had to get back home, back to the reserve to look after the church there. And it was the church there, the community, that put my name forward and said, we want this individual to be our next priest. So I had to get back as quick as possible. So I did studies, anywhere between 4 to 4 courses, every term, and to like I said, an accelerated program. And it was my wife who basically put me through seminary. She worked the front desk at the college, plus she worked all the extra shifts if there was movies and stuff like that, which basically paid double time. And it was my wife who put me through seminary. And because the reserve itself gave me the living allowance, that's a support portion for courses. And so I got $835 a month, and our rent was $960 a month. So we were constantly going in the hole. And just before we left, besides the $36,000, I was already in the hole from the restaurant. I paid for our daughter's wedding, and a very happy moment there, and they're still doing very, very well. So anyway, in the end, so now at this point in time in our lives, my wife and I, we live in Edmonton now. I was the Bishop of Saskatoon. I jumped that part, didn't I? So I started my ministry in the Diocese of Saskatchewan. And then at a certain point, I realized that the parish that I was appointed to plateaued. Priests, you know what I'm talking about. And where everybody was happy, everybody was great, but nothing was improving. I wasn't tasking them, challenging them to the next steps. And so what I did was that I talked with the wardens, and I said, I love you all, and I know you want me to retire here. But I love you so much. What I want you to recognize is that you need somebody who's going to take you to the next steps. And that's not me. I brought you this far through this healing journey. And so I had to make the hard decision of saying, I have to move on. And I took a place in Ontario, in Thunder Bay. And I was there for 4.5 years before, I lovingly say it this way, the bishops traded me off. And I was called one day by Bishop Stephen Andrews, who said, that Bishop Colin Johnson in Toronto needs an Indigenous priest. Would you be willing? And I said, sure. So I ended up living in Toronto for over 4 years. And then while I was there in that ministry, somebody called me up from Saskatchewan and said, your name has been brought forward for running for bishop. And I said, really? What an honor. So would you allow your name to go forward for the Episcopal election for a bishop? And I said, let me think about it and pray about it. But where's this for? They said Saskatoon. I thought, wow, okay. So we prayed about it, and at the 11th hour of the application and names going in, my wife and I called up after I consulted with my family, talked with them. And they said, yeah, they supported me. So I let my name go forward. And so I love my wife. We have been married now 45 years. And I remember talking to her and I said, my dear, I never want to see tears in your eyes. And I said, but don't think anything of this is going to come out of this election and nomination, my name. I said, don't think anything big will ever happen come out of it. I said, so I don't want you disappointed in any sense. So that's how we're going to go. We'll go watch the election and we'll go see. And it went fine. And so I thought, my name led right from the very beginning. And I thought, it was one of those mercy votes, where and then they pull the rug out from underneath you at the last second. So anyway, and then I remember Archbishop Greg Kerr-Wilson saying, we have an election, we have a new bishop. And I'm going, oh yes, finally, this is great. And he said, Chris, that's you. Me? And I think that was probably a major turning point in life. To get to this point has been an amazing journey. And in my conversations, I talk often about my mother. Even when I was Bishop of Saskatoon, when I would go back home to the reserve and I'd tell her, well, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And this is how we're going to get set up into the diocese. And she would always ask me, well, who do you have to ask? Who do you have to ask? Who do you have to get permission from? And I would always, so at the end of 3 months of this going, I said, Mom, why is it so hard for you to believe that I'm the bishop? I'm the Bishop of Saskatoon. And she said, well, that's because that doesn't happen to our people. That happens to the white man, not to us. And that brought another level of reality in there. The journey is never easy, especially if you're Indigenous, because I grew up with the adage, the life training, you might as well say, from what my mother was taught in residential school. And my mother was taught that you are nothing, you will never be anything, don't try. And, even up to this day, my mother's still my mother. And so when she does something and it fails, or else if not that, and she still has that training drilled into her. And so she would, I remember what was it? I think it was the cake fell or something like that, that she was trying to make. And so she got upset with herself. And she goes, stupid, I'm so stupid. And I said, Mom, stop. Don't say that. And I told her it was almost 6 years, maybe 8 years ago. No, it was longer than that. I'll say 8 years ago that I told her, I said, Mom, I said, I want to talk with you. And I said, I want you to know something. I want you to first to say to you, I am very, very sorry. And my mother, of course, well, what did you do? And I said, Mom, I said, when I was young, I thought you were so outdated, so from the bush, so embarrassing, and that you did not know anything. And I was embarrassed to have you, to be seen with you and everything in my life. And I said, now that I'm older, I now see the truth of it. You are the strongest, the most wisest, the most powerful woman that I know. and I am incredibly proud to say you are my mom. This is where we come to a reality of where we are as Indigenous peoples, of what was drilled into us and instilled in us through the residential schools, where we are less than, incapable of, or unqualified to. And you'll see this even to this day as it exists among the Indigenous clergy. They will sit at a table by themselves. Anyone who's ever been to General Synod sees this being played out, where they sit at a table by themselves because they don't feel qualified or bold enough, brassy enough to be able to sit at a table where there are non-Indigenous people sitting at the table, and where they feel qualified to be able to contribute anything to, whether it be in diocesan executive, or else, if not that, to any kind of organization, committee work. This is who we are. This is the reality we live in. Even as a bishop, I remember being told that, oh yes, there's a such and such company and policy holders that would like to be able to come in to have a visit with you, Bishop. And I said, okay, tell you what, I just got into the office. Give me a few minutes. Let me get my coffee. I'll sit down. I'll go in, sit down, get everything ready, get my paperwork out of my backpack, and set that up. You know, even there, I never thought. When I graduated seminary, when I graduated, college, and I thought, I'll never have to use a backpack again. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. I am free. There's my backpack. Even at this time, in this age of my life, I still travel with a backpack. So anyway, I digress. My little complaint. Thank you very much. Therapy, thank you. So anyway, so I went and got my coffee cup, and I went and sat in behind my desk, as bishop and everything else like that. I had the purple shirt on and everything else like that. And so the executive archdeacon came and introduced and said, yeah, this is such and such and such and such, who we're here for this such and such talk of meeting. I said, okay, great. And so they started talking, and they were directing all the questions over to the executive archdeacon, and who's not Indigenous, of course, and who's older and had more gray hair than I, and I had my hair up in front. And so anyway, and then finally it was getting a little, I could see that the executive archdeacon was getting a little uncomfortable with all of this. So finally he said, can we stop for a second? And he talked to the people and he says, this is the bishop. This is Bishop Chris Harper. He is the bishop of the Diocese of Saskatoon. So I leaned across the desk. Hello, how are you doing? How about we start over again? And this is indicative of how sometimes we are perceived and received as Indigenous people, as people of less. Because oftentimes, too often, our society sees Indigenous people as the ones that you encounter on the streets and street corners, who are panhandling. You got some loose change. And that is what you see as Indigenous people, rather than seeing them as an Indigenous person of a place of authority. To imagine me, mind you, as my grandfather would say, to me being the Archbishop. And so even within our own church, we still have those struggles of trying to find the reality of authority. So in this conversation of what I wanted to present and talk to you is about when we talk about reconciliation. What does reconciliation mean? And how can it be perceived and received and employed with a present mindset that we all have within us? I have had these questions asked of me, well, how we need to decolonize. And all I can say is, you don't know what you're asking. The colonial process is so ingrained into us, it's like breathing. And you don't realize how much structurally it's going to change things and what it means to see how you do things. The process of colonial process of hierarchy, of leadership, of determining who's going to say and have the final word, to have a bishop. Even the process of having a chief in the Indigenous is not the Indigenous way. That's colonial. Because they wanted one person that they could talk to and who would be responsible for the reserve. So thus they created the process of having a chief, one person. When in the historical process, for most of the bands, most of the Indigenous communities across this land, what they did was they had many leaders, many headspeople who would be in charge of either, say, the charge of, if they're more nomadic, tearing down the camp, planning the camp, the scouts, the warrior society. And do you see what I'm saying? They were the leaders of those different aspects of communal life. There was not one person who had voice and say for all people. That was introduced with the colonial system, the government. And so thus, when people, I remember that even in my youth and everything else, when you're pumping gas or something like that, and somebody wants to say, would you check the oil? Hey, chief, would you check the oil? So, and I'm not a chief. I'm not qualified enough to be a chief. So, but we're in a society, where we like to see things in our perspectives. And we see that as being problematic in many, many respects, because we like to think of ourselves, especially as a church, as a very inclusive society, very inclusive institution within the landscape of faith. And so, I grew up in a time and an age when things were changing. So I remember in my youth being at a Sundance with my grandparents and sitting, because I was young enough then and I didn't have to go through the rites of manhood, but I was still young enough to be able to sit with my grandmother and my aunties, in a certain place within the Sundance itself. And I remember in my youthful mind seeing the people at a certain part within the drums and the singing, where they would pop up behind these screens of poplar branches and everything else like that. And in my mind, I was thinking, they look like gophers coming up out of the hole. And I remember the happiness and the group and the community of what it meant to be in ceremony within the Indigenous context, within all the things that we did as in our spirituality. And I remember also at a certain point in stage where we all packed up, took the blankets, wrapped them up, and then we all went back home and we got into the horse and wagon. Boy, am I dating myself, here? Back into the horse and wagon, back and going over to home, putting on our Sunday best, going to church, and then after that, coming back home after the service, and then putting on our civvies or our regular clothes and going back out to the Sundance in the bush. Because at that point in time, all Indigenous ceremonies, anything Indigenous was illegal. It was, at least for my reserve, for the Plains Cree, we weren't basically human beings until 1964. 1964 was when we were allowed to leave the reserve. 1964 was when we were allowed to vote. 1964 was when we were allowed to be able to go into a store and buy things that we want, versus dependent upon the Indigenous or the Indian agent and the rations that were given out for the Indian people at that point in time. We couldn't leave the reserve without a permission. So all these things changed in 1964 when we became human beings within our own country. And I remember at that point in time, just things were changing so fast. I remember that at that point in time when power just came onto the reserve. And I remember my uncle Frank, who's only 8 years older than me, 7 years older than me. And he was playing with a light switch, on, off, on, off, on, off, and everyone just marveling with the power. We still had the outhouse. We still had do you remember the old cream cans filled with drinking water? 45-gallon barrel that had a tarp over it where you go pump water, and we had the old the car hood pulled by the horses, where you put a 45-gallon barrel and go pump. Remember those days? Sure do, Archbishop. But these That was the time. Changes. And this is the good thing about change. It happened even for myself in seminary. I didn't expect myself to be anything. I didn't expect to be anything other than the small priest that would go back to the reserve and to do my ministry there on the reserve. And I didn't expect anything of it. But it exposed me going to Toronto, where there's more homogenous, this more wider landscape that gets opened up to people within the society and system itself. And I remember being invited to Reverend Andrew Wesley's ordination at a Church of the Redeemer on Bloor. And that was the first time I ever heard an honor song and an eagle song sung in a church with a drum. That was the first time I ever smelt sweetgrass and sage being burnt up as an offering in the smudging ceremony. And that was the first time I ever saw an eagle feather held up in the church. And I cried because I never ever thought in my lifetime this would happen. Not in the Anglican Church. Not in the Anglican Church. I knew what I was going into, and I knew who I was and the conflict that still resided within me. And that all had to be reconciled to a point where I now stand before you as the National Indigenous Anglican Archbishop, and where to this day, even to this couple months ago, where somebody said to me, well, you're the Archbishop only to the Indigenous people. You're not a real Archbishop. And I said, God bless you. Or to where others have called me, I'm not really, it's not really a part of a ministry. We're just part of a program within the Anglican Church of Canada. So we still struggle to this day, still trying to find our place. And I do what I can as the rebellious son of a gun that I am to try to fight for change and to educate the people of what all that we are doing. Whether it be for this wonderful little book called United Nations Declarations of the Rights of the Indigenous People. And because we as Anglicans love it, it's UNDRIP. UNDRIP. United Nations Declarations of the Rights of the Indigenous People. And I was blessed to be able to go to New Jersey and to help draft a part of an amendment to this document when it was being written up, and another that was presented to the United Nations. And the people there of that nation, what they did was they presented these feathers to me. They're two feathers that are joined together. And if you take a look at them, this side here is from an older eagle. It's been beaten up. There's pieces missing out of it. It's been chewed up, and it's war-torn. That's me. I've gone through a lot of battles. The other side is white, showing the wisdom and the sign of purity. Hope. That's me. And at the time that they presented them to me, they said, we don't know why these two were joined together, but we've kept them that way, and we would be honored if you would accept them as they are. And I said, I will gladly accept them because they are who I am. I walk in two worlds. I come from two worlds. I minister in two worlds. So to be able to take these feathers as a symbol of prayer, because it's the eagle who flies the highest, who has the clearest eyes, and who sees and is able to carry up the messages, our prayers, our personal needs up to the Creator. So we use this as a symbol. And with these, I call my working feathers, I've got others that have been given to me when I was made bishop, when I was made as the Indigenous native priest for the Diocese of Toronto. I was given an eagle feather. If I get enough, one of these days I may be able to have a war bonnet. But right now, they're just enough to tie into my hair. These feathers stand as a symbol for me to remind me constantly of who I am and what I do. The feathers I also use to bless. These eagle feathers have blessed bishops, and they have blessed clergy across this land and individuals that need it in the process and the journey of healing that they're on. I carry them in what I call my feather box, and in my feather box I carry a bundle of sage that comes from Saskatchewan, where my daughter and granddaughter harvested them and picked them up for us and gave them to us, gave them to me. I also carry a small braid of sweetgrass, which I have used a few times. There's just usually it's a nice long braid that I put into a big circle. And believe it or not, I even carry within this a few of the blessed wafers from Holy Communion. This is my prayer box, my prayer bundle of who I am and where I go. And I carry it with me always. But there was a time that none of this would have been allowed. Nobody would have allowed me to be able to stand up here to talk about this. There was a time that as Indigenous people, we didn't have a say, we didn't have a voice, we didn't have a song. At General Synod 2023, who was there with me on that one? I introduced something new to General Synod 2023 that was incredibly radical. And you need to know I did not plan that. I did not plan it at all. But something in me said, this is the time. This is the moment. This is the time to be radical and challenge the people. Because you need to know, most people go to General Synod for the fun and laughter, right? Sarcasm. Absolute sarcasm. We come away from there, everyone remember General Synod 2019 in Vancouver? That was not our shining moment for the church. And we had the audacity to put that on YouTube. We had the audacity to put that for the world to see our lowest moment when we could not talk with each other and we fought. And so I approached Archbishop Linda Nichols at the time and I said, if this starts to go anywhere near that direction, I am going to resign. I'm going to step down. I will give you my collar and my stole and I will quit and go home and do something I've always wanted to do, learn how to work heavy equipment. And it was starting to go a little bit there, and that's one of the reasons that I introduced something that was so radical and so different. I introduced the Indigenous way of doing things in community called a round dance, and where the community gets together and everybody joins hand around the drummers and the drummers lay down a beat. And that beat carries throughout the whole gathering of the circle of all the people. And everybody does a very incredibly complex, hard, intricate dance called a side step. That's it. And I asked all of General Synod to do that. And everyone held hands. And I started this up. And I asked everyone, and I showed them, and I even went down on the floor and showed them, started it off, and how everybody was supposed to start moving sideways in one direction. Moving clockwise in the great circle of life. Everyone held hands, and something remarkable happened at General Synod 2023. Everyone started to smile. People were laughing and holding hands and looking across the circle and seeing each other smiling and laughing. We were one big community. We were one gloriously big, happy family. It is my belief that Indigenous Ministries has a lot to offer. I'm excited to see the direction that I get to offer the community, the church, to journey in a new way. It's more than just soup, sandwiches, and socks, as I always say, but it's about spirituality. Who we are as a people, as Christians, with Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior, to proclaim and to hold the gospel within the center of the sacred circle, and to remind the church this is where we need to be and come from. To have the Bible, the holy word of God, at the very center of all that we say and all that we do and who we are. There's enough of social agencies out there that are more than willing to help out, feed, clothe. Our call is to be the spiritual end of it, the spiritual aspect, to feed the soul. And I learned this because when in my time in EMS, in my time as an EMT, EMTA Advanced with 12-1 skills with medications and all the technology that I had, and holding the hands of so many who were dying, I recognized, and I was so frustrated in that work, because I felt like I was always putting a tiny Band-Aid on a huge gaping wound. And I recognized something has to change for the people, because I was doing ministry on the reserve, where I was seeing young mothers committing suicide, 15-year-olds committing suicide, car crashes. I saw more death than most people would ever imagine, and held the hands of the dying, laying under a truck that had overturned because of drunk driving, and to hear that young man screaming until he couldn't scream anymore, and he screamed only through his eyes as I held his hand, because there was nothing I could do. As soon as we lifted that vehicle off, he was gone. I've seen so much death, and I know the value of a soul, to see the energy, the twinkle in the eyes finally fade and go. Holding the hands of the dying. I've seen people go in amazing, horrible circumstance. I likewise have seen people go, a people of faith, in amazing, glorious ways, where a smile comes over their face because they see the beauty, the love, and all that they believe being revealed and transpiring in that eternity that happens between the last breath and the fading of the twinkle in the eyes. And where I thought in my own heart, I wish I could be there and see what you're seeing, experience what you're seeing. but I will in my time. All I need to say, though, is this is a beautiful time, a beautiful moment, a transitional time, a transitional state right now that we're in, where things are going to change. And they change because you are here listening. There's a reason that your ancestors worked so hard, slaved, sacrificed to have you sit right there, right now, to hear these words, to have it transformative in your life. Now that's up to you, whether you accept it or not. But it's up to you. But it starts with us when we talk about reconciliation. Now, I am fully aware of how comfortable those pews are. I know the diocese has been using this and has introduced this to many of you. It's the Disciples' Prayer Book, also known as the Gospel-Based Discipleship, which we in the Indigenous circle have been using, and that which we have given out. When we went to, believe it or not, this is one of the Lambeth copies. When we went to Lambeth in 2022, we made special copies of this. We took it to the UK and we introduced it and passed it out to the bishops. So it's gone international as well. These are just a small example of what Indigenous Ministries is doing right now in this moment. I bring you a message of hope. You hear enough messages of despair, of conflict, of anger and frustration. I bring you a message of hope. I'm going to ask everyone just to stand. We're going to take a coffee break for about 15 minutes. I'm going to come back and I'm going to sum everything up with another 15 minutes, and I'm going to show you what we can do as part of our Indigenous ministries, what we do in changing things. And then I'll tell a story, which I will give to you as a gift, so that you can share with your grandchildren and your children. And this will be my gift to you so that you can pass it on to them and they can pass it on to their little ones. So we're going to take a 15-minute break. Gives you a chance to chew on this, what I've said so far and what I've presented to you. And then after that, I'll do my summation. And then after that, I'll tell you a story as a gift. And then I'll open everything up for Q&A, questions and answers. Okay? So everyone please stand as you are able. Let's say a quick prayer, and then we'll have a coffee break. Creator God, we give you thanks and praise for this beautiful day that you've given to us. We thank you for the seasons, and even in the revealing of the wind and the snow and the cold. In the cold, you remind us to slow down. In the snow, you remind us of the purity of things that come down to cover all that which sometimes we see as ugliness. And the wind that gathers us in, so that this way we have to cuddle up with each other, or else, if not that, draw our coats in. We thank you for the ministry of this church.